Most of the time with Angular, when we want something to happen in the view, all we do is make a change in the model, and directives will make sure that the view and the model stay synchronized. This keeps our model and controller free of UI concerns, but there are some scenarios where it makes more sense to use imperative JavaScript code to interact with the view in a more direct fashion than relying on declarative HTML with directives inside. Some of these scenarios include forcing the browser to navigate to a new URL, or popping up a modal dialog box to force a user to input some data before we take some other action. And the solution to these types of scenarios is still not to touch UI-related objects directly from the model. Instead, there are services that can wrap these types of functionality. So for example, there is a location service in Angular, and if we need to read or write the location in the address bar of the browser, the model can talk to the location service, and the service can talk directly to the UI component. Again, this can be because the service presents a simplified API for that UI component, making it easier to use. It's also easier to unit test if a model doesn't touch that UI object directly. So let's take a look at a couple of these UI-related services. The location service, which can set the location in the address bar, and anchor scroll, which can force a window to scroll to a specific location in the HTML identified by an element with an ID. So here is the scenario I want to explore. Imagine the user has very little real estate on their screen, and when they come to this page and they do a search, those search results appear outside of the visible part of the window, so the user might not even know that those search results have appeared on the screen. What I'd like to do is, after the user has executed the search, after we have retrieved all of the data, I would like the window to scroll to make sure that the user details down here are visible. And to do this, I need to do a couple things. First of all, I'm going to need to ID an HTML element that I want visible. In this case, it will be very easy to find the element where the user details start. I'll give that element an ID. And then I need to use a service known as anchor scroll and tell it to scroll, make the window scroll so that element is visible. And that behavior is a little more indirect than what you might think. I do not pass the name or the ID of the HTML element to the anchor scroll service. Instead, what I have to do is actually change the fragment identifier of the URL. A fragment identifier is what will appear after the hash sign in the address bar of the browser. So if I give this HTML element an ID of user details, I'm going to have to set the fragment identifier in the URL to user details and then tell anchor scroll to go. So a number of changes to put together and a couple new services, but let's see how this works. I think I will start with user details. Let's come to this top div. I would like to give this the ID of user details. Try to get this div into the visible portion of the window. And now inside of my controller, I'm going to need two services. I'm going to need anchor scroll to do the scrolling, and I'm going to need location so that I can modify the fragment identifier inside of the URL. And now let me just reformat some of this code so we can actually fit all of our dependencies on the screen. Very good. Now, inside of on repos, because at this point we will have retrieved both the user information inside of on user complete and retrieved all the repository information, what I want to do is say location service, please set the hash or the fragment identifier to user details. And once that has been set, anchor scroll is one of those services that is a function I can just invoke. So two different services, only 2 lines of code required and 1 ID on a DOM element. Now I should be able to come back into my preview window. Let me do a hard refresh. We're starting up here. I do a search. We get all the results and the window scrolls down. It bumps down to make sure that that part with the user details is visible. And that's an example of a couple UI-related services. And UI-related services like location, they certainly make dealing with the address bar a lot easier than if you had to use the built-in APIs provided by the browser. For one thing, the location service can make sure that its functionality works across all the different browsers with all their little nuances and bugs. And now that we've used a few of the built-in Angular services, it's time to talk about why and how we could write our own service.